play itself. Point three, I've got down as the weird sisters and the witches. Okay, so first of all, there's just a terminology thing to mention here, and that is in shorthand, I mean, people usually talk about these three figures at the beginning as the three witches, although they think of themselves and they're referred to as the weird, Weird, sisters, right? And that term suggests um, well, I mean, it means something to Shakespeare and his audience that's maybe a little bit different than just calling somebody a witch, right? So, you call somebody a witch, and you're thinking of, like kind of long, crooked nose and a big black hat and I don't know, green skin or something like that, and riding around on a broom and whatever. But a weird sister, weird is a word. So, first of all, that weird is in Holinshed, right? So the accounts of, I mean, so Macbeth in the history that Shakespeare reads and then adapts into his tragedy, the historical figure Macbeth had a meeting, had an encounter with these three strange women. And Holinshed, drawing on his own, he himself is drawing on Scottish sources, calls those women the Weird sisters, right? So weird suggests something like not really of our world, right? That's weird. We'll say, right? We mean that's strange. It doesn't kind of fit into our expectations. And these weird women are sort of, they seem somehow to be, at the boundary, the liminal space between our world and some kind of supernatural world. Um, so I mean that's just a terminology thing. Now the first scene, Act One, Scene One, we just get, I mean, there's not a ton to the scene other than just suggesting for us that these characters are are witches, right? That they are, doing something supernatural. Um, the meter is strange, right? It starts with tetrameter. When shall we three meet again? In thunder, lightning, or in rain? When the hurly burly's done, when the battle's lost and won. That's so it's not iambic pentameter, it's not blank verse, it's rhyming tetrameters. Um, and and we know that they're headed towards Macbeth, but there's not. I mean, we know that they're what we would think of as witches, what we would think of as witches, because they've got familiars, a cat and a frog as like pets that do their bidding and that kind of thing. But there isn't a ton to that opening scene. But they do show up in Act One, Scene Three, and this is the part where I want to kind of focus for the next little bit here this morning. Um, so in Act One, Scene Three, you have they come on stage, and again, there's this kind of conjuring language, and they're certainly whatever they're meant to kind of seem strange and witch-like or whatever, right? The idea that the second witch is killing swine, right? The idea that if you're a farmer, like England is still a mostly agrarian nation, right? Most people are associated with farming as opposed to living in urban spaces and doing, kind of urban life and so on. And the idea that when something goes wrong with your crops or with your herd or whatever, not to think that, oh gosh, there's some kind of disease that's running through our herd, but to think, there's some kind of supernatural thing, I'm cursed or whatever. So where has thou been, sister, killing swine? I mean, that links up with kind of popular folkloric kinds of views of, like what it is that, that causes unexpected, what do you call it? Unexpected problems in England. Okay. So, and then, there's this kind of troublemaking aspect to it and kind of vengeance aspect to it and so on. Okay. But then, as Macbeth is coming towards the stage, there's a drum within. This is at line 29. And a drum. Macbeth comes, says one of the witches. And then they all join together in this kind of little sort of rhyme. Thrice to thine, thrice to mine, and thrice again to make up nine. Peace, the charms wound up. And then they go silent. And then Macbeth and Banquo walk on stage. And at first they don't see the Weird sisters. Macbeth, so foul and fair day I have not seen. Which, I mean, just a little sort of kind of side note here, right? But you foul and fair day, for when Macbeth says that, he's inadvertently, unknowingly referring or alluding back to Act One, Scene One, and the and what the witches had said when they left, right? Fair is foul and foul is fair, hover in the dusty and windy air, and so on, right? So this foul and fair day is kind of already attaching Macbeth to the Weird Sisters. And then they're just having a kind of basic conversation, Macbeth and Banquo. How far is it to Forres? And then all of a sudden, right, there's no stage direction in our text, right? But presumably at this point, there's a kind of shudder or kind of surprised look on Banquo's face as he sees those three weird sisters. What are these, so withered and so wild in their attire, that look not like the inhabitants of the earth and yet are on it, right? There's something peculiar about these women. They are both of our world and not of our world, right? And it's, I mean, so one of the kind of the big kind of questions I think in this play is, you know, to what extent is Macbeth a victim of what the witches are saying, or is he already on his path to these things, and the witches just are sort of helping push him along? But one of the things that's significant, I think, is that the women, the witches, the Weird Sisters, they don't respond to Banquo. They respond to Macbeth first. So he has this Banquo has this kind of long address to them, and they ignore him. And I've seen a couple of versions of this play, right? And there have been performances that I've seen where they have this kind of long, drawn-out, uncomfortable silence after Banquo addresses them. You should be women, and yet your beards forbid me to interpret that you are so. Quiet. Nothing. Right? They don't respond to that. But as soon as Macbeth speaks, speak if you can. What are you? All hail Macbeth, hail to thee, right? So there's the idea that on some level, not that he conjures them, right, but that he, that he makes it possible for them to speak, or that they're focused on him. And then they make this prediction, and it's an ambiguous one. It's, you know, and there's lots of debate about this. We're going to look at what this prediction is here. But they say, "All hail Macbeth, hail to thee, Thane of Glamis." And Thane of Glamis, that's his title at the beginning of the play. It means like Duke of, right? Thane of Glamis. And then the second witch, "All hail Macbeth, hail to thee, Thane of Cawdor." And that's going to be the kind of the linchpin, right? A lot of stuff is going to change around this idea about Thane of Cawdor. And then finally, the third one says, "All hail Macbeth, that shalt be king hereafter." Now, it's important right here. This is an example of dramatic irony in the play, and that affects how we're understanding what's happening here. But it's also setting us up for thinking about the big issue around the witches, for me at least, is ideas about destiny, providence, you know, something that's fated versus something that people can choose, right? That you have some sort of free will, or, you know, the ability to kind of affect your destiny, your future, kind of thing. Anyway, but back to the question of dramatic irony. "All hail Macbeth, hail to thee, Thane of Cawdor." Now, Macbeth and Banquo at this point, they don't think of him as Thane of Cawdor, but we do, or we're in a position to think of him as Thane of Cawdor, because in Act 1, Scene 2, the scene that just preceded this one, when the Scottish king, Duncan, is kind of like dealing with the aftermath of the rebellion that has been against his authority and so on, there's been a rebel against the king's authority who was the Thane of Cawdor, and he's been captured, and the king, that is Duncan, says, I have him executed, and let's give his title, Thane of Cawdor, to Macbeth. So we in the audience, in a strange way, right, we have a kind of foreknowledge of something that Macbeth is not aware of yet, right? So, "All hail Macbeth, hail to thee, Thane of Cawdor." Like, we know that he's going to be named or enrolled as the Thane of Cawdor, but he doesn't know that yet. And it's this piece of this detail that kind of clinches things for Macbeth. right? I'm going to skip over the prophecy to Banquo here for just a second. Um, the witches, they do talk to Banquo eventually. They set him up in various kinds of ways, and then they leave at line 78. And Banquo and Macbeth are like, "What exactly just happened here? This was a very strange thing." And then messengers come in from King Duncan, from the Scottish king. Um, and they're supposed to try to bring Macbeth to meet with the king and so on. And Angus, the one of the thanes, one of the dukes, says at line 100, "We are sent to give thee from our royal master thank." This is Act 1, Scene 3, around line 100. It's on page 11. "We are sent to give thee from our royal master thanks, only to herald thee into his sight, not pay thee." And the Earl of Ross, the Thane of Ross, "and for an earnest of a greater honor, he bade me from him call thee Thane of Cawdor. In which addition, hail, most worthy Thane, for it is thine." "Hail, Thane of Cawdor," says Ross, right? And Banquo, and again, we don't have any, like, the stage direct, there is no stage direction here, right? So I'm not sure if you'll ever get a chance to see a Macbeth, or if you've seen a Macbeth, right? What do Macbeth and Banquo do at this point, right? And it is often a kind of like complete, like a shudder, a shock. What just happened here, right? Those weird sisters just said that Macbeth will be, or is, the Thane of Cawdor, and he doesn't put any stock in that. "Thane of Cawdor lives," he says, right? And in fact, that's what Macbeth says right here at line 108. "The Thane of Cawdor lives. Why do you dress me in borrowed robes?" Which is, like, I love that expression, that borrowed robes, which you'll still hear people say that, in modern parlance, whatever. It comes from Shakespeare here, right? But Banquo's response to "Hail to thee, Thane of Cawdor," Banquo says, "What? Can the devil speak true?" Right? The fact that the weird sisters, the witches, called him Thane of Cawdor suggests that they have a kind of knowledge, right? That they're speaking some kind of truth, even if they are wicked, bad, evil figures. That they are capable of speaking the truth, right? And the truth is that he is Thane of Cawdor. And if he's Thane of Cawdor, does that mean that when they say that shalt be king hereafter, are they correct about that, right? So that prophetic aspect, particularly around Macbeth, but also about Banquo. We're going to come back and look at Banquo in 1 second. There's this kind of change that happens here, right? So in terms of what's happened when the Weird Sisters are on stage, the feeling is like, oh gosh, these are kind of scary, ominous creatures. Are they real? Are we dreaming this or whatever? And then they try to kind of laugh it off, right? There's almost every kind of adaptation I've seen of Shakespeare, of Macbeth, when they get to this point of Banquo and Macbeth, they're kind of trying to laugh it off, like that was a really weird thing to have happen. And then all of a sudden, bam! It turns out that something that the witches or the Weird Sisters said was true, and it's like, oh gosh, well, now we have to take them seriously. Okay. The other prophecy, though, is towards Banquo, right? Turning back again, this is back on page 9, Act 1, Scene 3, at a line 50 or so. So the witches say, "All hail Thane of Glens, Thane of Cawdor, that shall be king hereafter." And Banquo says, and he's talking to Macbeth, "Good sir, why do you start and seem to fear things that do sound so fair?" And like, I'll just point out, right? Like in terms of like making arguments for the quiz, like here's something that could have, that was important but becomes significant later, or isn't obvious but becomes significant later. Like there's an argument to be made based on the conversations that Macbeth and Lady Macbeth have, that Macbeth and Lady Macbeth have already been talking about the idea of Macbeth, challenging Duncan in some way and making himself the king, and that the Weird Sisters are just tapping into that already pre-existing ambition of Macbeth's. And historically, right? So just in terms of like the historic figure of Macbeth, right? He had various kind of claims to the throne through his wife. Lady Macbeth actually has a kind of claim to the throne, and so could Macbeth already have been thinking about this, and the Weird Sisters are only kind of articulating something that he's already been thinking. And maybe that might be one way of looking at what Banquo says here. And again, we don't know I mean, the words are just on the page, and we have to kind of figure them out, right? But um, is Macbeth's response to the Weird Sisters one of a kind of guilty look, like, gosh, how did they read my mind, right? How did they know that that's what I was thinking? Or is it that he's just genuinely shocked, like, what? What just happened here? Anyway, good sir, why do you start and seem to fear things that sound so fair? And then Banquo asks the witches, well, look, in the name of truth, are you fantastical, or that indeed which outwardly you show? My noble partner, you greet with present grace and great prediction of noble having and a royal hope that he seems rapt withal. Right? He's in a daze by what just happened here. To me, you speak not. If you can look into the seeds of time and say which grain will grow and which will not, speak then to me, who neither beg nor fear your favors nor your hate. So now Banquo asks, well, look, if you're out here handing out predictions and prophecies and reading the cards and looking in your crystal ball and predicting what's going to happen in the future, however it is, if you can see the future, what about my future? So a couple things. One, first of all, there's this kind of metaphor at line 58, the seeds of time. For the article that I'm going to have you guys, that I would have had you guys looking at, this was an important moment in that article. The idea of the seeds of time. The idea that there are, things will eventually come, like, all right, so my son, my 4-year-old, is outside right now with my wife, and they're going to be planting some seeds. It just happens to be that's the way it's working today, right? Some of those seeds that they're going to plant, some of them will actually grow, and some of them probably won't. That's just the way it goes, right? Not every seed is going to turn into something. And it's the same kind of thing here, this metaphor, the seeds of time, right? That there are these little teeny tiny specks of something now, which some amount of time in the future are going to flower into something, grow into something, turn into something. And if you can predict which ones are going to turn into something, then make that prediction about me too. What are the little specks about me right now that are going to turn into something down the road? Now, just back to the context thing for just 1 second. This is a significant thing that's about to be predicted here because King James, the guy who's the new monarch when Shakespeare's writing this play, he traces his lineage back to this guy Banquo. Banquo is the great 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 grandfather of King James, and so there's this is going to be significant what's about to happen here. First witch hail, second witch hail, third witch hail. Lesser than Macbeth and greater. And one of the things about the witches, right, is that they speak in this paradoxical, these two things seem like they can't be true, except if you look at it, squint and look at it just the right way. Well, maybe that's true. How can you be lesser than Macbeth and greater, right? Not so happy, yet much happier. Thou shalt get kings, that is, thou shalt be the father, thou shalt beget kings, though thou be none. So all hail Macbeth and Banquo, right? Now, Banquo's going to pick up on this in just a second, right? When they're trying to dismiss what's just happened, when the witches disappear, Banquo asks, this is at line 83, were such things here as we do speak about, or have we eaten on the insane root that takes the reason prisoner? Are we dreaming, hallucinating? And Macbeth has picked up on this right away. Your children shall be kings. And Banquo, you shall be king. Now, are they saying this mockingly, sarcastically? Oh, that can't be true. I mean, one of the things that is going to bother Macbeth all the way through this play, all the way through this tragedy, is the fact that Banquo's children are predicted to succeed him. And so, he doesn't know what to make of that, and he's really bothered by that. Anyway, so once the first little piece of the Weird Sisters' predictions has started to come true, that he's the Thane of Cawdor, there's this kind of quiet dialogue between Macbeth and Banquo that presumably Angus and the rest of them aren't overhearing. This is at line 116 or so of Act 1, Scene 3. It's on page 11. Macbeth turns to Banquo. Oh, sorry. He seems to say this to himself, probably. Glams, that was the title at the beginning of the play. And Thane of Cawdor, that's his new title. The greatest is behind, right? What's behind door number 3? And then he says to Ross and Angus, thanks for your pains. And then he says to Banquo, Do you not hope your children shall be kings? When those that gave the Thane of Cawdor to me promised no less to them? And Banquo's response, quietly, kind of sotto voce, that trusted home might yet enkindle you into the crown, besides the Thane of Cawdor. And then there's a warning in Banquo's response here. But 'tis strange, and oftentimes to win us to our harm, the instruments of darkness tell us truths, win us with honest trifles, to betray us in deepest consequence. Right? So Macbeth, he doesn't want to spell out the first part of it. He jumps to the second part. You, Banquo, your children might be kings. Well, Banquo responds, if that's true, it's also that you'll be king. And if you're going to be king, how do you get there except for by killing our current king? And so he's like, let's be careful about these half-truths, right? These enigmas that we're hearing, which might lead us into some kind of danger, some kind of risk to our soul, and that sort of thing. Okay.